If you're a woman recovering or attempting to recover from burnout, you're going to want to hear from this naturopathic doctor with years of experience working with women recovering from burnout and the lessons that she's learned along the way in helping these women so that you can recover faster from your burnout. Hi, I'm Dr. Patricia Mills, and welcome to the Wild Wisdom Show. I'm a medical doctor with a different spin on women's health. I'm a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation, and I'm a practicing functional medicine doctor. And I love taking complicated science and breaking it down for you so you can start implementing it right away for immediate results. And I am so excited to be talking today to my guest speaker, Dr. Kate Hazlitt. Dr. Kate is a naturopathic doctor. She's practicing in Ontario, Canada, in the town of Goderich. So if you're from her neighborhood, you should definitely look up her clinic there. And if you're not, you should listen to her wisdom, because this is something you do not want to miss. Burnout is a huge problem for our population, in particular women. And the problem with burnout is that until you hit it, you may not even recognize you're going towards it. So if you've got a sneaky feeling you're heading towards burnout, definitely listen up. If you've been through it, then you know. And you're also going to want to know exactly what you can do to prevent the burnout. So let me just see here. I want to make sure that we can see Dr. Kate's name here. Let me just play around a little bit with the banners. There we go. And it looks like I'm still learning all this stuff for Streamlabs, but it's Dr. Kate Hazlitt. Hi, Dr. Kate. How are you?
Oh, I'm well today. Thank you for having me, Patricia.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. We've been connected for a few years now. And we actually had, I think it was that we had a similar mindset coach.
Yes.
That, yeah, through through Adele Tevlin. And so we have, talked a lot in women's groups about things like burnout. And so what is your experience as a naturopathic doctor, or maybe even like a personal experience with burnout? Anything you'd like to share with the audience for them to get an understanding of your perspective?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. So I think the years that I've been practicing, burnout has been the unlabeled, unnamed person that or woman that walks through my doors into my clinic. And what I never really named as burnout, to be quite honest, I don't necessarily put labels on things in order to keep it fluid and flexible, and kind of present that open-minded approach. But as we got into that time of the pandemic, I started to dive more and more into what women were experiencing as, and what we would name and call burnout. And what I was seeing is what I would call like a emotional exhaustion, and where that could manifest physically, but there's this flavor and this energy of just being completely emotionally, mentally exhausted, hovering in the background and creating like a disconnection for women, as they want to be connected to their families and to themselves, and to the richness and meaning of life, that what we might call purpose. And yet there was something kind of missing. And so when I started to actually call it burnout, it was really helpful to navigate this pathway and develop sort of a framework around what do we do with this disconnection? How do we stay connected to ourselves? And what do we do about this emotional exhaustion piece? Because we present so physically, and the physical part is just kind of one entry or one portal into healing. And when we can look at this emotional flavor, I think we can develop a more richness of what is actually happening with someone at a really deep level, at a cellular level.
Oh, that's so, yes, I absolutely hear you. And the emotional exhaustion piece is so key. And it's interesting because many roads lead to Rome, many roads lead to burnout. Everybody has a very unique experience of it. And I find that, as a type A individual, high achiever myself, I didn't know I was heading to burnout until I hit it hard.
Oh.
And, it's like the duck paddling on water, like everything looks okay from the surface, and the legs are kind of going crazy underneath the water. And I found that from a young age, I disconnected my brain from my body. So I disconnected my thoughts and this, like, feeling the sensations in my body as a protective mechanism.
Yeah.
And that allowed me to survive when I was younger, when I was moving from Brazil to Canada various times. I wasn't in a school for longer than 2 years because of the moves and various other factors. And being the new girl in school and being the new person in, like, the lunchroom, all those things, it felt so uncomfortable in my body that I just totally, like, stopped. I didn't allow myself to feel it anymore. I wasn't taught how to express it. And so I just stopped feeling it. Like, I just made myself stop feeling it so I could move on and with my life. And that was helpful at the time. But what happened was, for me, there were physical signs that I was starting to burn out that I didn't pay attention to, and I ignored for those reasons. Like, just I stopped
Mhm.
paying attention to the fact that my constipation was getting worse. I was starting to have, like, aches and pains and the difficulty recovering from my workouts, sore muscles, sore jaw from the clenching and the neck tension, all those things. And as you mentioned too, it's like not realizing that emotional exhaustion and how that can play out for individuals is different. For me, I was more irritable, I was more short tempered. I found it harder to laugh easily and
Mm.
to let myself go and enjoy the moment. And so everything started to be held tensely rather than loosely and in a relaxed manner.
Yeah.
And even when I hit burnout, I think it took a little while in retrospect to recognize that that's what had happened, because the way it manifested for me was I stopped being able to cope with
Mm.
things that I previously would have been able to cope with. So instead of coping, I gave up. And for me, what that meant was leaving a position in the hospital, like one of the positions I had. um, there were changes that happened, and instead of being able to cope with them, I was just like, this is too much for me. So I let go of that position. And, it's funny because in retrospect, it was a good thing in the long term. That position was no longer something that I was attuned to in terms of my future, my destiny, so to speak. But it arose out of burnout, and rather than choosing to leave it on my own terms and gracefully, I just was like, boom, I'm done. I I I'm giving up on this position, and it was like such a sense of failure and incompetency on my part. So it like worsened the emotional exhaustion
Yeah.
rather than improving it. So I think you mentioned before we started recording that sometimes it's like a wake up call,
Yeah.
and it took me a while to realize that that was my wake up call to say, what you're doing and how you're doing it, although it initially was good for you and maybe you were on the right track, you've gone off track. Or maybe you've, like, reached the end of this particular journey and it's time to start something else. And so your body's giving you signs and your behavior is giving you signs, but if you're not paying attention to it, and part of it is because we're so afraid of stepping out of our comfort zone.
Mhm.
Usually the thing that's causing the burnout is the comfort zone. It's the toxic job, the toxic relationship, the toxic social media. It's part of our daily habits and routine, and breaking free from those things requires quite a bit of courage. And burnout sometimes is like, well, you don't have the courage for this, so I'm just going to shut down your body. So you have no choice but to leave this, job that no longer serves you and this relationship that is no longer good for you, right? So it's kind of interesting where it's almost like you could look at burnout negatively, or you could look at burnout from a positive perspective and say, like, you had a lot of opportunity to change course and you haven't. So now it's just like complete shutdown. You have to change course.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Like it's the two sides of the same coin, right? And whatever perspective you're going to take with you on the journey um, will be part of, I think, what ultimately propels the healing. Like there's almost something, we might call it essence or the inner wisdom or something that's moving through our being that this gets set up, this circumstance gets set up in order to take a different set of stepping stones. I always think of this quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's by A.H. Almas, and that the sources of what happens to us in our experiences are sources of nutrition that help us create create our potential and expand our capacity. And so a wake-up call to burnout is one of those stepping stones. I think that we can use it to propel us into expanding our potential. And instead of being in this state of constriction, we can go through this some talking through fire, really, but to serve ourselves in the most highest potential that we're here on earth to do, right? So it's like something in your stories, something you had one track of this is what I meant to do, and something else took over and like, no, Patricia, we have another way. We're actually going to go in this direction.
Totally. I think you're speaking about some kind of higher guidance.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, the higher guidance, like
Yeah.
something that moves through us to change course.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I also subscribe to that perspective, right? Like some people do not have that perspective, and I have to be
Yes.
honest and say I didn't used to.
Yeah.
And now I do have that perspective. And the difference is that it allows me to relax more in the moment
Yeah.
when even when things are happening that appear to not be, appear to not be good. I always think to myself, everything is happening for my highest, best good. And it's not that I had to go through burnout to get to where I am. I could have been better at recognizing the signs of impending burnout and course corrected and averted the burnout while still taking this new stepping stones, as you say, that of my higher guidance, which depending on who you are could be God, the universe, the divine feminine, mother nature, the energy that is within all of us and moving through everything and directing its course in some way in an either evolution or destiny or whatever you want to call it. And so it's, and the more that you ignore those subtle signs that are initially subtle and then become kind of screaming in your face, if you ignore them.
That's right.
And for some people, it could be the ultimate manifestation of cancer, right? Or some kind of chronic disease of which at least part of it, if not all of it, but at least part of it can be linked to, body stress that comes from not listening to, not paying attention to what is serving you physically and emotionally in your life.
Yeah, and it sounds harsh, but I think stress is the ultimate killer at the end of the day. And where I think our knowledge and media and, the word stress is almost like maybe we've tuned it out a little bit and normalized chronic stress is now daily stress. And there's, at the root of all of that, I think there's just this massive disconnection that we have from our bodies, which, like you were saying, at one time, there's a survival adaptive response in that disconnection. And when we when we don't have that ability and reference point of tuning into the body, we can miss the cues. We can miss the cues until all of a sudden there is a chronic disease that is like been happening for quite a long time. And I call it the pileup effect. So we have the pileup of our experiences, our stored survival responses, which we could also call traumas, that get lodged at a cellular level. And when they're not allowed to move and be processed, then we experience symptoms, which are the body's manifestation of alarm, of threat. And so what you might find, the women and people that you support and that I support, they're coming to us because there is a dysregulation happening in the nervous system. They're operating in the world in survival, in a survival stress response. And that stress response needs support. And if there are traumas and that stored trauma response that is happening in the background, that piece needs safety. And without the safety, there's going to be a difficult time in navigating that healing journey. Safety is kind of this foundational. It's like what builds the house. If you're going to build a new house, you need to have that foundation of safety, not just with yourself, but in relationship and experiencing that connection. And our connection can be a really valuable resource in creating the path of health and well-being. I would almost say without it, I'm not sure any change is possible.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I can't overstate the importance of the stress response. It's actually one of my 4 pillars of whole body health. So, which are gut health, hormone balance, stress response, and toxins tolerance. Because it's funny because there's a healthy kind of stress, right? Exercise is not too much, not too little, but enough exercise is a healthy kind of stress, right? Cold and heat exposure, not too much, not too little. And there's a certain amount of life stress, which is good. It's the kind that drives ambition. It's the kind that drives personal growth. It's when your perceived stress becomes so high, and trauma can be big T, little t, and no one can look at someone and say, well, that's trauma and that's not. It's an internal lived experience. What might be traumatic for you may not be traumatic for me, and vice versa. And so I think we just have to accept that it's the human experience to perceive moments of trauma in our lives, no matter how incredible our parents may not have been, or our upbringing may or may not have been. We're going to be introduced to situations in which we perceive something traumatic has happened, and therefore we adjust to that experience. I do not know a single human to date that has not undergone that to some level.
Yeah.
What tools you're provided as you grow and develop will allow you to either move through that trauma experience and perception either, gracefully and smoothly, and get to the other side with that personal growth that was intended for, really, or it's going to be like a super choppy, experience that does build up these long-term residual issues, starting with hormonal imbalance from the stress hormone cortisol, which is mediated through the nervous system. By mediated, I mean the nervous system gets activated with stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's multiple neural networks that get triggered with the perception of a stressful event. And there's many consequences of that, one of which is the release of the stress hormone cortisol. And that hormone, again, is good in small amounts, not good in large amounts, and can be extremely damaging to the tissues. And I do want to dive into the nervous system part, but I want to start framing our conversation a little bit around the fact that when we first started talking, before we started recording, was you mentioned you have offered a program for women that helps them recover from burnout, or in other words, periods of excess stress that overwhelm us physically and emotionally, so that we have a period after which we can't cope for a period of time, and hopefully that period is short, but for some people it's quite prolonged if they don't get the right help, and it can show up as fibromyalgia or other conditions, right? And you mentioned that that program over the years had gone through various iterations. Like, you improved it every time as you worked through. And I was curious if we could frame the conversation around lessons that you learned working for women that prompted the changes in your program, and what kind of changes were they? Like, how did you finesse that program for women with the assumption that the improvements, like the changes in your program, led to better outcomes for these women recovering from burnout?
Okay, good. So this program, I called it but beyond burnout. So you could look at that of like you're so burnt out, you're beyond burnout. Like what kind of life force do we have? Or it could be kind of this expansion, like I'm on the other side of it, right? So I really framed it initially as a 12-week program that took burnout as like a little bit of a slant of addiction, because we get addicted to the chaos of because our nervous system might only know extreme sympathetic response, or it only knows a freeze, right? So we can flip flop back and forth between these two responses.
Can I just clarify for the general audience the sympathetic response? Do you want to clarify what the sympathetic response is? Because some people may not have never heard that term.
Yes, good idea. So our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system is really broken down into two pathways that have three kind of organized emergent properties. So we have the sympathetic nervous system that we would call the fight or flight nervous system. It's what helps us defend or escape. It also is what is going to allow us some motivation. So our sympathetic nervous system is what gets us up in the morning, essentially. But it can it can go into overdrive, where now, I might only function in my sympathetic response. And then we have the parasympathetic, which is what we would call the rest and digest. So this is operated by the vagus nerve. It touches every organ. And this is what's going to bring us into a relaxation response and also assist our digestion. So not one is better than the other. They all have different emergent properties that help us to function and feel safe in the world. We need a flavor of both to move about. It's when we become lodged into like a dominant system, and we lose the flexibility of the nervous system to actually move through it I need to defend myself, I need to get away, and then I'm going to return to safety. So we mammals in the wild, they don't actually experience trauma because they return to safety. They return to their daily life. Humans, on the other hand, we get stuck in these responses. So I framed, coming back to the program, I framed it based on that we can get stuck in these responses, and then that is the pattern that our bodies know, and we return to them over and over and over again. So the 12 weeks was really set up as, let's treat this as a flavor of a 12-step program, and spend 4 weeks nourishing our bodies, becoming connected with our bodies on a hormonal level, on a nutrition level, on a gut health level, prioritizing sleep. And then we go just a little bit deeper under the surface and examine our triggers, our perceptions, our emotional health, how we respond to the world emotionally. And then we're going to take it just a wee bit deeper and spend another 4 weeks in cultivating a self-compassion and what that means to be connected to our heart and lead heart-centered lives. And for me, this deepening of the practices and the conversations, what I found was women really uncovered these parts of themselves that never got an opportunity to be expressed. And the next iteration of that of the programs really expanded on the emotional well-being piece and providing this context of a connection with other women. And so that became what produced the outcomes of safety. And when that was present, then the physical functions, like tuning into the nutrition, tuning into more cyclical living, honoring our body's needs for sleep and rest, that became a little more intuitive, because it wasn't this forced structure. Women were able to connect with self-compassion. Means that I can honor that need to go to bed at 9 p.m., for example. So there was a softening that came out of this program for women. They examined sort of these abandoned parts and were able to breathe a little bit more life force. And for me, then, that was part of the burnout recovery, is having more access to our life force, that it's not being pressurized like it's in an Instant Pot or something, and that we have to, produce these perfect children and perfect nutritional plans. And it just allowed a softening, like when you can tune into your body and feel that maybe constriction in your gut, or a tightness in your chest, or a burning in your throat. Now you know that means something. That's like a sign that I am not speaking my truth, or my heart has closed and I'm abandoning my own needs to putting others first. It's like back to that oxygen mask thing. I think that's where we maybe run into burnout, is the needs and the compassion is all like oozing out of us to everybody else. And it's this recognition in my program that compassion is it's a two-directional valve. It's bidirectional. It can go out, but it also has to come back. And we resource that in ourselves, and we have more access to life force. So all the iterations of what I have done have kept the framework of body, mind and emotions, and heart, which for me is compassion. But I've experimented with how long do we need to hang out in those places. And my most recent iteration is really kind of getting down into attachment and authenticity, so that when we're connected to our heart, when we're connected to our own needs and really understand those needs at a deep cellular level, then we can move through our world and be active in our careers and our families with this authentic self leading, and not the need of the attachment or the relationship. So it went a little deep this third time, or no, sorry, I would say probably the fifth time. It went a little, like, quite a lot deeper. And that's informed by my work as a compassionate inquiry practitioner, and really bringing in the heart of compassion and how important that is to our health and well-being.
Wow, that's so cool. And I have a lot of questions. One question I have
Blabbed
is,
on there.
yeah, that was awesome. Were there any parts of the program that you dropped over the iteration?
Let me think. Was there any parts that I dropped? No, I don't think I dropped anything. What's this? I merged. Because it started very linear, like 1 week, like week 1, this, week 2, this. And some of the topics got pretty deep that we needed more space around it. So I merged self-compassion and reparenting. I merged those two things, like inner child work and self-compassion. I brought those two modules into the same week, and we just kind of dove into it a little bit deeper. I didn't cut anything. I just refined it so it was a little more integrative and not so choppy.
Nice. And so I'm going to ask you, not my next question, but I'm saying it out loud so I don't forget. We're going to talk about inner parenting a little bit. But before that, was there anything beyond the process and the merging? Was there anything that you added over the iterations of the program?
Oh, yes. The last one I did, I added more information on the nervous system and bringing in polyvagal theory. And I actually included a practice that I really find helpful, which is nervous system mapping, or autonomic, I think we call it autonomic mapping. So it takes a person through each emergent property of the nervous system, the sympathetic, the dorsal, and the ventral, which we haven't talked about because we haven't gone into polyvagal, but it really stems from polyvagal theory, as which means the science of safety and connection, and what that means in relationship to our nervous systems. So it's a practice to unpack how we respond and believe, our beliefs about self and how we see the world. So our perceptions based on when we're in a sympathetic state, when we're in a parasympathetic state, and when we feel safe and connected. It's really quite remarkable how our perceptions about ourselves and others and how we see the world, how it shifts based on where we are on the autonomic ladder as it corresponds to polyvagal theory. So that really helped women understand themselves at a deep biological level, because our nervous system it functions just without our conscious intervention. It just is going to respond when there's a real or perceived threat. It's going to respond a certain way. And when we can have information about ourselves and what's happening at a body level, at a mental level, our thoughts, how our behaviors change based on where we are in our nervous system, it actually is quite empowering to have access to that information, because self-understanding, I think, is beautiful medicine, because it takes the blame and judgment out of it. You can have access to more compassion for yourself when you're like, well, of course I would have, responded that way. What other option did I have in that moment? So with that information, now we can perhaps choose a different pathway and a different flavor of how we actually want to respond, from the notion of our best self, not our reactive self.
So yes, I've heard of the polyvagal theory, and I think it's quite fascinating. And correct me if I'm wrong. It's the vagus is the nerve that basically is a large nerve that goes from our brain stem. So it's like the brain and the brain stem. And the autonomic nervous system is the part, as you mentioned, that we can't control. So, for example, although it's interesting, we are learning we can control aspects of it that we weren't aware of, but like our heart rate, sweating in our skin, goosebumps, digestion, right?
Yes, that's right.
Those things happen without our conscious intervention, but we can consciously intervene. Like
Yes.
we breathe unconsciously, but we can change our breath rate.
That's right.
And we can actually modulate our heart rate, change our heart rate with things like meditation and deep breathing and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And the polyvagal theory, as I understand it, is that the vagus nerve it's the pathway from the brain to the other organs of the body, like the heart, the gut, everything like that. Every body part actually is connected to the vagus nerve in some way, with few exceptions.
That's
And
right.
the vagus nerve is the part that regulates primarily the relaxation response, like the rest and digest. But it's more complicated in that, and that's why it's like the polyvagal theory, where there's more than one function of the vagus nerve. And I think as it's the function of that was recently discovered, which is the function of freezing, right? Like is that what it is? It's the,
Yeah.
because there's the opposite of the vagus nerve are all the nerves that control the fight or flight response. So it's like either you run away from a challenge or you stay and you fight it, or you can, you know, perceive it that as like, okay, this isn't actually like a scary thing. This is like something I can, you know, respond to in a different way, as you mentioned. Like, okay, here is for example, a deadline at work, right? A new deadline. It seems impossible to achieve. So your system gets turned on, the sympathetic nervous system gets turned on. So your heart rate goes up, your breath rate goes up, you get tense. You're like, oh, you know, your thoughts are like, oh no, what do I do? This is going to be terrible. And I'm so stressed out. Whereas someone that's able to go into the parasympathetic nervous system would see that deadline and say, okay, you know, this may be a problem, but let me think about all the tools I have in my toolbox. Who can I call to help out? Can I speak to the person about this deadline? Maybe I'll change a few things around in my schedule. Maybe I'll set some boundaries and say, you know what, this deadline is unfortunately not something that I can reasonably meet. It's not a reasonable expectation. So let's work on a new deadline. So it's, you know, as you say, like using your higher level faculties to influence going into either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic response, right? And so how does the polyvagal theory inform that differently, right?
So the polyvagal theory, whose work is by Stephen Porges, and it really came out of this hierarchy of the nervous system. So mammals have the social engagement system, and that's actually the first front-facing response that we have to the world. So that's the vagus nerve and how it impacts more of the facial muscles and our tone of voice and how we move our eyes and how we might turn. And that's the system of connection. And this is the system that when we're connected, there's also that ability to be with another in a safe way. So if that system doesn't come online in response to a threat, and very quickly we can perceive like, okay, that person's not making eye contact. There's like a funny, like, you just get that sense, right? And this is in polyvagal theory, what is called neuroception. So it's that, we might call it intuition. You just get a sense, a felt sense of like, this is a little hinky.
Yeah.
So
I perceive something about the way you're interacting with me, like your facial expressions, like
there's
the
a threat.
smile, lack of smile, your eye movements, and it's triggering alarm bells in my system.
That's right. So when our social engagement system is not going to diffuse and we're going into now a threat response. And that's when the sympathetic is either going to go online into a fight or flight. I'm either going to defend myself, and that could look like irritability, or I get impatient with you, or I give you a, snippy tone of voice back. Or I'm just going to say, I'm not doing this right now, and I'm out the door. So and sympathetic isn't connected to the vagus nerve. It's actually a set of spinal nerves that if you reach behind your head and put your arm down your back and your opposite arm up your back, it's just sort of that thoracic lumbar space is where the sympathetic nerve engages. But maybe in this circumstance, a perceived event that we're discussing, that you can't get away and you can't really defend yourself in a way that brings that threat response back to that level of connection. Now I'm going to disconnect just a little bit and I'm going to go into freeze. So I'm going to sense inside myself, like, this isn't going anywhere. I just got to be in this situation and deal with it somehow inside of myself. So I'm just going to numb out. I'm going to disconnect a little bit. I might lose eye contact with a person. I might start crying. That's a parasympathetic response. And then I'm just going to tune out. I'm just going to totally zone out. So the extreme aspect of a parasympathetic in a threat response is dissociation. I'm not going to even be here right now. Can't listen to this. Off I go somewhere in my own spaceship.
That's fascinating, because it is, listening to this, we always kind of relate things to ourselves. It's sort of a human tendency. And
That's right.
Yeah, the not making eye contact. I do notice that when I'm more stressed out due to other things that have nothing to do with social interactions, right? Maybe it's a business thing or my to-do list. It does negatively impact the way that I then interact socially with other people in my life. And one of the things I do notice is making less eye contact,
Yeah.
which is fascinating to me to hear this actually, because now I'm realizing, oh, that's why it's this nervous system response to an imbalance in the way that our body is dealing with and responding to stress in our lives.
That's right.
Mm.
That's right. And these properties of the nervous system, there's both these, they can operate via a threat response, but there's also like a daily survival response that's necessary. Like I mentioned earlier, the sympathetic system online to wake us up in the morning, like that baseline level of cortisol wakes you up and gets you through your day. There's a motivational energy present. And parasympathetic controls our digestion, our heart rate, our, those are helpful emergent properties. It's when the threat response, now it's going to take those properties and make them in service to survival of I need to do something. And then the problem becomes that we stay in that state, in that energy. And
Well, you mentioned the word addiction at one point, which I found it's addiction is a strong word, and I can 100% relate to that and say that when I was at my most achieving, state, where I was, staff at a hospital, faculty at a hospital, the lead researcher, in my division of, research, head of research for the residents, and, doing very complicated medicine and a rising star in my division. I can honestly say I was addicted to that lifestyle. And if I took, and if I wasn't achieving in something and everything was just kind of settling down and relaxing out, and I would feel uncomfortable, like something was missing.
Yeah.
And I would go back into action to get back to that high level of achievement. And it's interesting because recovering from burnout and staying out of going back into it, for me, and I'm sure for lots of women, looks like letting go of the addiction of that high,
Yeah.
constant excitement and accomplishment and achievement and doing, and being okay with things like cooking and doing the day-to-day, playing on the floor with the kids.
Yeah.
And really, for me, what that looks like right now is not checking social media constantly, right? For that dopamine hit of achievement, in terms of am I making the impact, even on that level? I mean, making an impact is important, and that's my goal, is to make an impact. And one measure of impact, of course, is how many people interact with you on social media, what you're sharing on social media. And I have to be so careful to not get addicted to that. And when I'm meditating, which is something I introduced into my lifestyle to help with that, to lower down the nervous system and get from a sympathetic to parasympathetic state, I find that my thoughts are often going along like what can I do in my business to have a bigger impact, right? And while that may seem positive, and it is positive, obviously, it's not healthy if it's running my life all the time,
That's right.
right? So it's
Yeah.
like, you know, recovering from burnout and being burnout free doesn't mean you just stop achieving and you stop doing everything. It does mean being okay with having an off button, you know? Like, and not feeling uncomfortable with being in the off button position, right?
That's
Like
right.
off social media, off achievement, off, accomplishment and all those things, and just being like it's kind of like I noticed that, for example, the addiction of food plays out where people just are addicted to having like flavor in their mouth, whether it's from drinking or eating or having a beer, having a drink, having a coffee with milk or latte or whatever. It's like almost where I'm comfortable with just having an off button with respect to having something in our mouth, just
Yeah.
like not eating or drinking, period. Right? It's
Yeah.
that in
Absolutely.
itself is addictive.
Yeah.
And getting healthy is like being okay, like losing the addiction of just constantly having stuff going into our mouths. Absolutely
Yes.
right.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, addiction is such a strong word because it brings up these perceptions that we have of addiction, but we're all tapped into something.
Mhm.
Every single one of us. We there's a something that we use to soothe discomfort. It's not like why the addiction, it's why the pain. There's a hole, there's a sense of deficiency, and we use behaviors, not just substances. We use behaviors, we use thought processes, we use nervous system activation to be an obstacle and cover up what we're just not prepared to look at, a sense of deficiency, a hole on the inside. And it can come in all shapes or forms. So I don't know if any one of us can say that we're not addicted to something, right? So it's a I think a broader way of looking at addiction that brings a bit of humanity and more compassion to it, because we all do something to distract ourselves from actually being with ourselves.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's like sometimes it's not even that there's a perceived deficiency. It's more like, hmm, it's boring, And if we're not taught as kids to like be okay with boredom, and in boredom, you find creativity and you re-energize yourself, and doing nothing and just being, right?
That's
Just
right.
the simple pleasure of, they call it in Zen, I think, chopping wood and gathering water.
Just basic
Yeah,
stuff.
just like, you know what, it's okay to just maybe it's one personal growth item would be to be comfortable and okay with like cooking and just
Yeah.
doing that, or walking somewhere without listening to a podcast, or having like calling someone to talk on the phone, just simply walking there, and that's something for me that I find myself consciously having to do sometimes, where it's like I'll go for a walk. And now I do it every morning, where I go for a walk and I don't listen to a podcast, or I don't call someone to chat with them. I just simply go for a walk.
Yeah.
And now there's this simple pleasure, like the sweetness to just being by myself, going for a walk without the distraction,
That's right.
right?
Right. Yeah, it really our nervous systems love that. And it connects you with your senses. It connects you into the world and orients you around. And it that sweetness is what safety and connection, like another word to describe it.
Mm.
And I think that's just so important and healthy for our nervous systems to access that. Like that's what's going to ultimately, that connection and feeling safe is part of the burnout recovery.
Absolutely. And reflecting back on the women who have gone through your program, having health programs myself, there's a proportion of people who do very well,
Yeah.
and then some people who don't do so well, right? Like, and I think my success, I measure my success rate, and I would say you know, um, it's about, I try to keep my programs less than 20, like I do group programs, right? So I
Yes.
try to keep it like around the 20 person mark right now. It seems to be a good number for now. And I find that 18 do very well, and two, they don't do so well. And they all go through the same program, right?
Hmm.
So reflecting on the women who don't do so well at the end of your program, what would you say are the lessons learned about some of the barriers that people put up for themselves in
Mm.
the recovery process?
Yeah, I would say I've got a similar um, rate that you just mentioned. There's always a couple of people who it just it could my assessment of would be it's just, well, I'm initially going to say it could be my energy at the time. Right? Like I will think, okay, how that we just didn't have a connection. Um, and then my other thought there is it just for that particular individual, it's the level of commitment and maybe the willingness started out pretty fresh, and then it kind of peters out. So there's this, we might call it the seeing it all the way through. They had a stopping point, and that would typically be a little more than halfway through when it's time to do self-inquiry. So
How
kind of
interesting.
gotten out of the fluff of the physical body, and now we're into like the nitty-gritty of now the sessions that we spend together, they're really calling on sort of these deeper levels of, like, we're going a little deeper in the basement of the psyche. Like, we're going to unpack a few more boxes that maybe are getting quite musty and dusty down there. And it's a little more than halfway through that we get to that place. And then, like you said, there's a couple of individuals then, like, they just stop showing up, or they're not really chiming into the group Facebook chat, that type of stuff.
Well, that's a very, I found that actually quite fascinating because what I kind of get from that, correct me if I'm wrong, is that um, these women don't do as well, like their outcomes are not as good. And it looks like they're self-sabotaging in a way
Mm,
when it comes time to look at an important potential root cause of things that cause burnout, which is a lack of self-awareness and self-inquiry that leads you to then make choices that lead you to burnout, right? And so some of us are our own worst enemies when it comes to recovering from things like burnout or health conditions. And I see that as well in my programs. And I would say it's different yet similar in the sense that some people surrender completely to a process even when it gets uncomfortable,
yeah.
and especially when it gets uncomfortable, recognizing that I need to do all of the things to get the best outcome, and I'm willing to go into that discomfort. For in my case, for sometimes it's like a group elimination diet, right?
Mm,
And it's so interesting to see how there are some women who are like, okay, there's never a good time, so I'm just going to do it with the group even though this is terrible and I don't like it, right? Just the concept of it is scary, and then they do it and it's totally fine and it's easy, and all of a sudden it's over.
that's
And then
right.
there's people it's like just all the excuses, right? Like, I can't do it for this reason, that reason. It's like, well, there's never going to be a good time, but you're in this group program, now's the best time. And it's the same thing with self-inquiry so that's the physical level, and like the mental emotional level. It's like, well, there's all of these blocks to your ability to fully be yourself and to be fully present, and in that way making choices that will help you recover from burnout and faster and prevent it. And yet there's this discomfort. It's getting out of your comfort zone
Yeah.
to do that. And for women who come up with all of these internal and external excuses to not get out of their comfort zone, they're simply not going to experience the most success with it. And so when I hear that, like, 18 out of 20 people of your group experience success and a couple of them don't, and it just so happens to be around that time point,
Mm-hmm.
It obviously is not an issue with how you relate to them, right? It's an internal self-sabotaging experience, and at some point in time in their lives, it may not be during your program. However, at some point in time in their lives, they're either going to have to come to that and deal with that,
Yeah.
right? Or they may never learn it in this lifetime as a life lesson, that we do need to have this capacity and to step out of our comfort zone and do some real self-inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that look like in your program? What do you mean by self-inquiry?
So self-inquiry gets into our core beliefs. So the beliefs that what we start believing about ourselves at a really young age, and how that begins to inform how we interact with others, relationships, including the one we have with ourselves. And the self-inquiry also looks at body sensations, looks at emotions. Tara Brach, she summarizes it quite well in her process of RAIN. So recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. And so when we start to recognize, when we become a little unfrozen and we start to recognize, oh gosh, like I've got a pit in the bottom of my stomach all the time, like, or I'm walking around with this lump in my throat all the time. When we start to develop the awareness at the body sensation level, then we can choose to inquire into what's happening. What emotion is there? What belief about myself am I holding at the level of my tissues? And so the self-inquiry goes pretty deep to look at what is my body holding? What is it trying to tell me? What does it want to say? What needs to be expressed that never got the opportunity to be expressed? And just circling back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about outcomes and success, I think it's also a sign that for some people it's just too much too soon, and that's okay. Sometimes we have to titrate with the nervous system, because as we begin to heal and support the physical body, it gives the emotional bodies a lot more space to come up to the surface. And so we might need to deepen the body practices and hang out a little longer in that space before we can go a little deeper into the self-inquiry. So the self-sabotage pieces, like I have really started to see that as there's something that's activated my threat system. And the resistance comes in because in some way, at some level of my being, I'm perceiving a threat, and my nervous system is going to function in a way that corresponds to that threat to help me move through it. And so all my old patterns are going to come back up. So if we look at it from a too much too soon, it just opens up a little bit of space that maybe we need to work at something a little longer before we can go to the next level. And that's okay.
Nice. I like that reframe. Actually, it's more positive, and it provides like a solution for women who, as you say, get stuck. At some point in time, and it's like it's compassion.
That's right.
Yeah, it's saying, okay, this is okay too, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and rather than maybe it would be like the lesson learned is, rather than disengaging from the group and the program, which gives you a feeling of failure, it's rather to say, these are the things that you can do instead in this moment, right? These body practices that you can bring into play as we progress through these different stages, and you can witness the stages and witness other people having their transformations and experience. And it's okay if you're not ready for it yet.
That's right.
And have some compassion for that as well. I like that.
Yeah, and I've learned that also through my own experiences, being like doing group work and in mindset coaching and business coaching that, and this could be just part of who I am too. I do kind of have to navigate my own path. And so it might look on the surface like I'm not doing or taking the coaching or being involved, but it actually is, I have a good sense of what feels right and what I have capacity for. And I might then just tweak it to adjust to my nervous system, because my nervous system is going to respond to the coach's nervous system and vice versa, right? So if we kind of have these nuances of how our nervous system operates, we have a lot more access to, I don't think that feels good. I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do this piece a little longer, and really honor what my parts need, not what has been imposed, prescribed, because what's coming up for me is my experience. And to me, it just feels empowering rather than, and it's more, I'm not waiting for someone externally to tell me what to do.
Mm-hmm.
I can navigate that myself and hang out in that particular practice a little longer, because that's what my system needs.
Mm-hmm. Nice. I like it, because the thing is that in our lives, I think we need to, as much as we can, reframe events in as positive and love-filled light as possible,
Mm-hmm.
with the least amount of judgment on others or for ourselves.
Yeah.
And as long as we're, I think, honest with ourselves behind the reason, right? There's a difference between avoidance and recognizing when something is just not right for us, and saying, okay, this is where I need to take some time, some space, and do things differently, right?
Yes.
There's so, and it's tricky. I don't think that it's necessarily, and again, it's something that requires a lot of self-awareness, and you have that self-awareness from a lot of the work that you've done.
That's right.
Some of us might accidentally do that.
Right. Without really recognizing why you're doing it. Your system just kind of does it for you in a way.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse to understand.
Yeah, I know. And that's the thing.
Overthink
I think that when we don't know, why not reframe it as a blessing, right?
That's
and just
right.
be like, well, I don't know, but might as well be a good thing. I'll just say that to myself. This is a good thing, So
that's right.
Yeah, as long as we're being very honest with ourselves. And I think that's the part where what led me to burnout was I just wasn't really being honest with myself in terms of when I hit burnout. Actually, I was being totally honest with myself up until the point when I hit burnout. Like, I loved doing what I was doing. I loved everything that led me to burnout. I was loving.
It could be very deceiving if you loved it, right?
Yeah, right. It's like I loved the work. I loved the high. I loved the high from the addiction. But it was when I finally just couldn't do it anymore. I wasn't honest with myself. I was just like, it's so funny how, and it leads to the point of like every person's experience is so unique.
Yeah.
Right. Because some people burn out because they're doing things they don't love, and some people burn out as they do things that they absolutely adore.
That's right. Yeah.
And the outcome, though, is very similar, where you just crash and burn and you can't do almost anything for a while. So that forces you to reassess. And for me, it's been a lot of having a trust in that higher force, just circling back to that, having that trust, just, and doing a balancing surrender with, being, kind of making plans for the future, but also surrendering to what is happening and all those sorts of things. So I love that there are women like you out there helping women like us, like me, who need it and who recognize they need the help. There are women out there, and for a while this was me as well, where I did not realize I needed help. Yeah. And I didn't formally get help for burnout. I found my way through it. And as a result, it took me quite a few years to recover. And what I can say is that when you find someone like yourself with experience helping women, and it's not just the training, it's the lived experience. As you mentioned, as you offered this program, you tweaked it, you improved it, you finessed it, and it will probably continue to be tweaked and improved and finessed as you go along. And that's beautiful. And it's so important that people realize that it is a process, and you need to tweak and improve and correct as you go along with everything, right?
That's right.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much for your work,
Mm.
for your assistance in this very important area. And if people want to follow you or connect with you, where would you recommend that they look?
Oh, so my website kind of gives a good feel and energy about who I am and sort of the flavor of how I work in the world. And it's www.drkatehazlittnd.com. And I'm on Instagram at Dr. Kate Hazlitt ND, although I haven't been super active lately. It's something that ebbs and flows for me. I used to kind of push past what my tolerance was for providing content and posting. And I'm kind of in a new iteration of going through some personal experiences, just had me kind of step back a little bit. And I have in my mind, like, oh, I really should get back to that. But anytime I find myself saying should, it means I'm judging myself. So,
Absolutely. No, I
right.
agree. There's an ebb and flow to
Yeah.
providing responsibly and energetically positively on social media. So I get that.
Yeah.
And before we wrap up, what is one thing you would recommend that the audience, the listener, the viewer could do that would result in some immediate positive changes in their life with respect to what we've been talking about?
Oh my goodness. Well, it goes back to what you said about honesty. I think taking a breath and checking in with yourself, and um, if you're saying that you're fine, I always say fine is the worst F word that we could say. So if you're just okaying through your day and you're noticing that you're surviving on fumes, then reach out for help and support, because that someone will be there to hold your hand. And it's that honesty piece of like, yeah, maybe I'm not doing so good, right? And it's okay. No one We all have our limits, and there's also great potential for expanding capacity to actually thrive. So
When the student is ready, the teacher appears.
that's right. Honesty, and be willing to be curious about what's happening for you.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Dr. Kate. I appreciate you. And for you that's been viewing or listening, if you enjoyed this, please save, share, and subscribe. Sharing is caring, and we need more women out there learning this vital information so that you can all achieve your best health. And I look forward to seeing you at the next episode of the Wild Wisdom Show. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, day, or night, depending on when you catch this. I'll see you soon.